The morning started perfectly for Danny Cooper. The 28-year-old electrician from Birmingham had been planning this London trip for months. It was supposed to be special, a celebration of his 3-year relationship with his girlfriend Lisa. They'd saved up for this weekend getaway, booking a nice hotel near Westminster and making a list of all the tourist spots they wanted to visit. Danny woke up excited, checking the weather app on his phone. Sunny with a few clouds, perfect for walking around the city. Lisa was already in the shower, humming that song she always sang when she was happy. Everything felt right in their little hotel room overlooking the Thames. After breakfast at a small cafe near their hotel, they started their tourist adventure. First stop was the London Eye, where they took dozens of selfies and marveled at the city spreading out below them. Lisa squeezed Danny's hand as they reached the top, pointing out landmarks she recognized from movies and TV shows. "Look, there's Big Ben," she said, her face pressed against the glass. Danny smiled, watching her excitement more than the view. This was why he loved her. She found joy in simple things. Back home in Birmingham, their routine had become predictable. Work, pub, television, sleep. But here in London, Lisa seemed to glow with happiness. They spent the afternoon walking along the South Bank, stopping at street performers and browsing through the book market under Waterloo Bridge. Danny bought Lisa a vintage postcard of the Tower Bridge, and she tucked it carefully into her purse, promising to frame it when they got home. By late afternoon, their feet were tired, and Danny suggested they find a pub for a drink before heading to Buckingham Palace. They'd saved the palace for last because Lisa had been talking about seeing the guards for weeks. She'd grown up watching movies about royal families and had always dreamed of visiting London. The pub they found was called the Crown and Anchor, a traditional British pub with dark wood panels and the smell of fish and chips hanging in the air. It was the kind of place Danny felt comfortable in, reminded him of his local back home. They found a corner table and Danny ordered a pint of bitter, while Lisa chose a glass of wine. 1 pint became 2, then 3. Danny was feeling relaxed, more relaxed than he'd been in months. Work had been stressful lately, with his boss constantly breathing down his neck about deadlines. But here, with Lisa laughing at his jokes and the alcohol warming his chest, all those worries seemed far away. "You know what?" Danny said, leaning across the table. "I've been thinking we should move in together properly. Get our own place, maybe closer to the city center." Lisa's eyes lit up. "Really? You mean it?" "Course I mean it. Life's too short to play it safe all the time." They talked about their future, making plans that seemed possible in the golden light of the pub. Danny felt bold, confident. The alcohol had loosened something inside him that usually stayed tightly wound. He was funnier, more charming. Lisa kept laughing at things he said, touching his arm when she spoke. Other customers came and went around them. Office workers stopping for a quick drink after work. Tourists studying their maps over pints. Locals settling in for their regular evening session. The bartender, a middle-aged man with graying hair, kept the glasses full and the conversation flowing. "Another round?" Danny asked as he finished his 4th pint. Lisa checked her phone. "Maybe we should head to the palace soon. The guard change happens at specific times." "Just one more," Danny insisted. "We're on holiday, aren't we?" The 5th pint hit differently. Danny's words came a bit slower, his gestures a bit wider. He felt invincible, like he could take on the world. The stress of his regular life seemed like something that happened to someone else, someone smaller and more worried than the man he was right now. Lisa was still nursing her 2nd glass of wine, watching Danny with a mixture of affection and slight concern. She knew this mood. Danny got like this sometimes when he'd had a few drinks. Usually it was harmless, just him being louder and more confident than usual. But something about today felt different. "You all right, love?" she asked. "Never better," Danny grinned, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "I feel like I could do anything right now. Anything at all." When they finally left the pub, the late afternoon sun hit Danny like a warm blanket. London looked even more beautiful through his alcohol-enhanced vision. The buildings seemed taller, the colors brighter. Even the crowds of tourists looked friendly and welcoming. They walked toward Buckingham Palace, Danny's arm around Lisa's shoulders. He was telling her stories about his mates back home, exaggerating for effect, making her laugh. A group of Spanish tourists asked them for directions, and Danny gave them elaborate instructions with grand hand gestures, as if he'd lived in London his whole life. "You're in a good mood," Lisa observed as they approached the palace gates. Best mood of my life, Danny replied. This is our weekend, Lisa. Our time to be different, to be more than we usually are. As they got closer to the palace, Danny could see the crowds gathering around the gates. Tourists with cameras, children pointing at the guards, the familiar red uniforms standing perfectly still. His alcohol-brightened mind began to work differently, seeing the scene not as a historical attraction but as entertainment, as a challenge. Look at them, he said to Lisa, nodding toward the guards, standing there like statues. Bet they're dying to move, to react to something. Lisa was taking photos, not really listening to Danny's commentary. She was focused on capturing the moment, this thing she'd dreamed about since she was a little girl. The palace looked exactly like it did in all the pictures, but seeing it in person felt magical. Danny, meanwhile, was studying the guards with the focused attention that only comes from several pints of bitter. In his current state, everything seemed like a game, a performance. The guards weren't people doing a serious job. They were actors on a stage, and he was part of the audience with the right to participate. I bet I could make one of them crack, he said. More to himself than to Lisa, the thought planted itself in his mind and began to grow. Danny Cooper, electrician from Birmingham, tourist for the weekend, had drunk just enough to believe he was funnier, cleverer, and more entertaining than he actually was. The guards, in their serious uniforms and professional stillness, looked to him like the perfect straight men for his comedy routine. Lisa was still taking photos, completely absorbed in the moment. She had no idea that her boyfriend was beginning to see their peaceful tourist visit as something else entirely, an opportunity to prove something, to be the center of attention, to show everyone around them just how bold and fearless Danny Cooper could be. The crowd around Buckingham Palace was thick with tourists from every corner of the world. Families with young children pressed against the black iron railings, cameras clicking constantly. Tour guides spoke in different languages, pointing out details about the architecture and the history of the royal residence. Danny stood among them, swaying slightly as the alcohol continued to work through his system. The late afternoon sun felt warm on his face and everything around him seemed to pulse with possibility. Lisa was beside him, completely absorbed in taking the perfect photo of the palace facade. This is incredible, she whispered, adjusting her phone's camera angle. I can't believe we're actually here. But Danny's attention had shifted entirely to the guards. There were several of them positioned at different points around the palace entrance, each one standing perfectly still in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. Their rifles were held at precise angles, their faces completely expressionless beneath the shadow of their ceremonial headwear. The guard closest to where Danny stood was young, probably in his early 20s. He had the kind of straight-backed posture that only comes from serious military training. His name was Private Ben Russell, though Danny had no way of knowing this. Ben had been standing at his post for nearly an hour, maintaining the perfect stillness that was required of his position. Ben Russell had joined the Army 3 years earlier, straight out of college. He'd always been drawn to the discipline and tradition of military service, and being selected for ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace was an honor he took seriously. Every day he put on the uniform knowing that he represented not just himself, but his regiment, his country, and centuries of military tradition. Standing guard required a special kind of mental toughness. Tourists would try everything to get a reaction, making faces, shouting, even touching the guards sometimes. Ben had learned to focus his mind on a single point in the distance and let everything else fade into background noise. He'd developed techniques for dealing with the heat, the cold, the weight of the uniform, and the constant attention from visitors. Today had been fairly typical. Families taking photos, children asking their parents why the guard wouldn't move, the occasional teenager trying to be funny. Ben had seen it all before and maintained his professional composure throughout. Danny, however, was studying Ben with the intense focus of someone whose judgment had been compromised by alcohol. In his current state, the guard's stillness looked less like professional duty and more like a personal challenge. Look at that one there, Danny said to Lisa, pointing directly at Ben, standing there like a robot. Bet he's dying to scratch his nose or something. Lisa glanced up from her phone briefly. They're trained to do that, Danny. It's their job. But everyone's got a breaking point, haven't they? Danny's voice was getting a bit louder, drawing glances from nearby tourists. I mean, he's still human under all that fancy dress. A family with 2 young children was standing near them, the father explaining to his kids about the history of the guards. The mother was trying to get both children to stand still for a photo, while the kids were more interested in staring at Ben, fascinated by his absolute stillness. "Why doesn't he blink, Mummy?" the little girl asked. "He does blink, sweetheart. But he's very good at standing still because it's his important job," the mother explained patiently. Danny overheard this exchange and felt a surge of confidence. If a little kid could get close to the guard, surely he could too. The alcohol had convinced him that he was funnier and more charming than usual, and the idea of entertaining the crowd around him was becoming irresistible. "Watch this," he said to Lisa, straightening his shoulders. Lisa was adjusting her camera settings and didn't really hear him. She was in her own world, trying to capture the perfect shot of the palace with the guard in the foreground. This was the photo she wanted to show her friends back home, proof that she'd really been to London, really seen the things she'd dreamed about. Danny began walking toward Ben, his steps slightly unsteady but filled with purpose. As he got closer, he could see more details of the uniform, the precise way everything was arranged, the quality of the fabric, the weight of the ceremonial rifle. Up close, Ben looked even younger, which somehow made Danny feel more confident about his plan. "All right there, mate," Danny said cheerfully, positioning himself directly in Ben's line of sight. Ben's training kicked in automatically. He'd been taught to ignore distractions, to treat tourists' attempts at interaction as if they simply didn't exist. His eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, his breathing steady and controlled. Danny waited for a response that didn't come. Around him, other tourists were starting to notice the interaction or lack thereof. Some were pulling out their phones, sensing that something might be about to happen. "Not much of a talker, are you?" Danny continued, his voice carrying across the immediate area. "Must get boring, standing there all day like a statue." An elderly American couple stopped to watch, the husband whispering to his wife about whether this was part of the normal tourist experience. A group of teenagers from France gathered closer, one of them already recording on his phone. Ben remained perfectly still, but inside, he was assessing the situation. The man in front of him smelled of alcohol and was showing signs of impaired judgment. His stance was slightly aggressive, his voice was getting louder, and he was clearly trying to provoke a reaction. Ben had dealt with situations like this before, but something about this tourist felt different, more persistent, more determined to break through his professional facade. "Come on then," Danny said, his voice now loud enough that people 20 feet away could hear clearly. "Just a smile. Just a little nod. Show us you're human under there." Lisa finally looked up from her phone and saw Danny standing face to face with the guard. A cold feeling of dread washed over her. She knew that look on Danny's face. The combination of alcohol confidence and stubborn determination that sometimes got him into trouble back home. "Danny," she called out, but her voice was lost in the general noise of the crowd. Danny was now completely focused on Ben, treating the situation like a game he was determined to win. The alcohol had stripped away his usual social filters and replaced them with a bold recklessness that felt exciting and powerful. "I bet underneath all that fancy gear, you're just a regular bloke like me," Danny continued, stepping even closer, "probably thinking about what's for dinner or when you get to go home or whether that girl over there is checking you out." The crowd around them was growing larger, sensing drama. Tourists love unexpected entertainment, and watching someone try to break a royal guard's composure was exactly the kind of authentic London experience they could talk about for years. Ben's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was trained for this, but the man's persistence was testing his patience. Still, he maintained his position, his breathing, his focus. Years of military discipline held him steady, even as Danny's voice grew more insistent, and the crowd's attention became more intense. Danny interpreted Ben's continued silence not as professional training, but as a personal challenge that he was absolutely going to win. What had started as Danny's attempt at harmless fun was quickly transforming into something much more serious. The alcohol in his system was amplifying every emotion, turning his playful confidence into aggressive determination. Standing there in front of Ben with dozens of tourists watching, Danny felt like he was on stage performing for an audience that expected entertainment. "Still nothing?" Danny said, his voice now carrying a sharp edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Come on, soldier boy. Give us something. Anything." Ben Russell maintained his position, but inside, warning bells were starting to ring. His training had taught him to recognize when situations were escalating beyond normal tourist curiosity. The man's body language was becoming more aggressive, his voice louder and more challenging. Other guards around the palace perimeter were subtly taking notice, though they remained at their posts. Lisa finally managed to push through the growing crowd of onlookers. She could see that Danny had crossed some invisible line from playful tourist to potential problem. The look on his face was one she recognized from nights when he'd had too much to drink and decided to pick arguments with strangers in pubs back home. "Danny, come on," she said, reaching for his arm. "Let's go see the other parts of the palace." But Danny shrugged her off without even looking at her. His entire focus was locked on Ben, as if breaking the guard's professional composure had become the most important thing in the world. "Your girlfriend's trying to save you from embarrassment," Danny said to Ben, his voice now loud enough that tourists 50 feet away were turning to look. "But I think we both know you're not going anywhere, are you? Just going to stand there like a toy soldier while a real man talks to you?" The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer entertaining tourist behavior. It was becoming something ugly and confrontational. Ben's military training included extensive preparation for dealing with hostile individuals. He knew that engaging with Danny would only escalate the situation further. The best course of action was to maintain his position and let security handle any problems. But the personal nature of the insults was testing his self-control in ways that regular tourist antics never did. An older British man in the crowd spoke up. "That's enough, mate. Leave the lad alone." Danny turned toward the voice, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. "Mind your own business, Granddad. This is between me and Statue Boy here." The crowd was becoming divided. Some tourists were still treating it like entertainment, holding up phones to record the confrontation. Others were becoming uncomfortable, gathering their children closer and moving away from the immediate area. A few were looking around for security personnel. "I'm talking to you," Danny said, turning back to Ben and stepping even closer. "You think you're better than me because you've got a fancy uniform? You think standing there like a mute makes you some kind of hero?" Lisa tried again to intervene. "Danny, please. This isn't like you. Let's just go. This is exactly like me." Danny snapped at her, his voice now carrying across the entire courtyard area. "I'm tired of people thinking they're better than us. This whole city, this whole country, everyone acting like they're so superior." The alcohol had unlocked something deeper than just social inhibition. Years of feeling overlooked, undervalued, and ordinary were pouring out in a stream of resentment directed at Ben, who represented everything Danny felt he could never be. Disciplined, respected, important. "You know what your problem is?" Danny continued, now pointing his finger directly at Ben's chest. "You think you're special. You think that uniform makes you something more than just another working-class bloke who follows orders." Ben's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. The words were hitting closer to home than Danny could have known. Ben had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester, not so different from Danny's background in Birmingham. The uniform did represent something to him. An escape from the limited opportunities he'd seen growing up. A chance to be part of something bigger than himself. A security guard finally appeared at the edge of the crowd, speaking quietly into his radio as he assessed the situation, but he was still too far away to intervene directly, and the crowd was thick enough that reaching Danny would take time. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." Danny's voice had risen to a shout. "Look at me!" The demand for eye contact was the clearest sign yet that the situation was spiraling out of control. Danny's need for acknowledgement, for some sign that he mattered, was driving him to increasingly aggressive behavior. Lisa was now genuinely frightened. She'd seen Danny get into arguments before, but never like this. Never in front of so many people, never with someone who couldn't fight back. The Danny she knew was generally good-natured, even when he'd been drinking. This version of him seemed like a stranger. "You're nothing," Danny said, his voice now carrying a venom that shocked even him. "You're just a puppet in a costume, standing there for tourists to take pictures of. You're not a real soldier. You're not protecting anyone. You're just decoration." The word decoration seemed to hang in the air with particular weight. For Ben, whose service meant everything to him, whose uniform represented genuine sacrifice and commitment, the insult cut deep. His jaw tightened further, and for the first time his perfect stillness wavered almost imperceptibly. Danny caught the tiny reaction and felt a surge of triumph. There we go. I saw that. You're human after all, aren't you? You can hear me, you can feel what I'm saying. The crowd was now openly uncomfortable. Parents were pulling their children away. Elderly tourists were shaking their heads in disapproval. And even the teenagers who had been filming were starting to look concerned rather than entertained. What's it like? Danny continued, emboldened by what he thought was progress. Knowing that you'll never be anything more than this? Standing here while people like me live real lives, make real choices, do real work. The irony of the statement was lost on Danny in his intoxicated state. Here he was, an electrician on a weekend trip, taunting a trained soldier about having a real job. But alcohol and anger had combined to create a logic that made sense only to him. Ben's training was being pushed to its limits. Every instinct told him to respond, to defend himself and his service. But his discipline held even as Danny's words became more personal and more vicious. "Answer me," Danny shouted, now standing so close to Ben that their faces were only inches apart. "Say something. Prove you're more than just a dressed-up mannequin." Lisa made one final attempt to reach her boyfriend. "Danny, you're scaring me. This isn't who you are. Please, let's just go back to the hotel." But Danny was beyond hearing her. The combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and the audience of tourists had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. In his mind, breaking Ben's professional composure had become a matter of personal honor, a way to prove that he was just as good as anyone else. The security guard was getting closer, but Danny was too focused on Ben to notice. The moment was approaching when words would no longer be enough, when Danny's need to provoke a reaction would drive him to cross the final line between verbal harassment and something much more serious. The tension in the air around Buckingham Palace had reached a breaking point. What had begun as an afternoon of tourist fun had devolved into a public confrontation that was making everyone uncomfortable. Danny stood face to face with Ben, his breathing heavy, his face flushed red from alcohol and anger. The crowd had grown significantly, but it was no longer the cheerful gathering of tourists taking holiday photos. People were nervous, uncertain whether they should stay and watch or move away from what was clearly becoming a volatile situation. Some were still recording on their phones, but the mood had shifted from entertainment to genuine concern. Danny's mind was operating in a haze of alcohol and wounded pride. Every second that Ben remained silent felt like a personal insult, a confirmation of every feeling of inadequacy that Danny had ever experienced. The guard's professional composure, which was meant to be admirable, had become a symbol of everything Danny felt was wrong with his own life. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Danny's voice had dropped to a harsh whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "Standing there in your fancy uniform thinking you're better than everyone else." Ben could feel the shift in Danny's energy. Years of military training had taught him to read body language, to recognize when someone was moving from verbal aggression toward physical action. Danny's stance was changing, his weight shifting forward, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Lisa was now openly crying, torn between embarrassment and fear. The man standing in front of the guard bore little resemblance to the boyfriend she'd been laughing with just hours earlier. The Danny she knew was kind, gentle, someone who helped elderly neighbors with their shopping and always held doors open for strangers. This version of him seemed possessed by something dark and ugly. "Danny, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "This isn't you. This isn't who you want to be." But Danny was beyond reach. The alcohol had stripped away not just his inhibitions, but his connection to his better self. In this moment he felt powerful, righteous, justified in his anger. The quiet tourist who had started the day taking photos and making plans for the future had been replaced by someone driven by a need to prove himself at any cost. "Look at me," Danny suddenly exploded, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "I'm talking to you." The security guard was now moving through the crowd more urgently, speaking rapidly into his radio. But the press of tourists and the distance he had to cover meant he was still precious seconds away from reaching the confrontation. Ben's breathing remained controlled, but every muscle in his body was coiled and ready. His training had prepared him for exactly this scenario, the moment when a hostile individual would cross from verbal harassment to physical assault. He could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon. "You know what I think?" Danny said, stepping even closer until he was violating every concept of personal space. "I think you're scared. I think underneath all that training and tradition, You're just another scared little boy playing dress-up. The insult was calculated to hurt, and it found its mark. Ben had joined the military partly to prove to himself that he was brave, that he could be the kind of man who stood up when others couldn't. Having his courage questioned struck at the very heart of his identity, but his training held. Ben's eyes remained fixed on the distant point he'd chosen when he'd first taken his position. His breathing stayed steady. His grip on his rifle never wavered. He was a professional soldier, and he would not be provoked into abandoning his duty. Danny misread Ben's continued silence as confirmation of his accusations. In his alcohol-clouded judgment, he saw not discipline and training, but weakness and fear. The idea that he had discovered the truth about this supposedly superior soldier filled him with a twisted sense of triumph. "That's it, isn't it?" Danny pressed on, now so close that Ben could smell the beer on his breath. "You're terrified. All that training, all that ceremony, and you're still just a frightened little boy who can't even speak up for himself." The crowd was openly hostile toward Danny now. Muttered comments about disgraceful behavior and someone should stop him rippled through the gathered tourists. But the combination of British politeness and tourist uncertainty meant that no one was quite willing to intervene directly. An elderly woman finally spoke up loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is absolutely appalling. That young man is serving his country." Danny spun toward her voice, his face twisted with rage. "Serving his country? He's standing there like a decoration. I'm the one with a real job, paying real taxes, doing real work." The outburst revealed the deeper currents of resentment flowing beneath Danny's aggression. This wasn't really about Ben at all. It was about Danny's own feelings of inadequacy, his sense that society didn't value people like him, his frustration with a world that seemed to respect uniforms and traditions more than honest labor. But in his intoxicated state, these complex feelings had been simplified into a single urgent need. He had to make Ben react. He had to prove that the guard was no better than him, no stronger, no more worthy of respect. "I'm done talking," Danny announced, turning back to Ben with a finality that made several tourists step backward instinctively. Lisa screamed his name, a sound of pure desperation that cut through all the other noise around the palace gates. She could see what was about to happen, could recognize the moment when her boyfriend's anger would transform into action. Ben saw it too, the subtle shift in Danny's posture, the way his right shoulder dropped slightly, the tension gathering in his arm. Everything slowed down as Ben's combat training kicked into high gear. His mind cleared of everything except the immediate threat assessment and response protocols that had been drilled into him through countless hours of preparation. Danny's hand curled into a fist. The rational part of his mind, buried deep beneath layers of alcohol and anger, was screaming warnings that he ignored completely. This was the point of no return. The moment when a day of poor decisions would crystallize into a single, irreversible action. The crowd held its collective breath, phones still recording, witnesses to a confrontation that was about to cross the line from embarrassing public display to serious criminal behavior. "I'll show you what real strength looks like," Danny muttered, pulling his arm back. Ben's muscles tensed imperceptibly, every sense heightened, every instinct focused on the threat before him. Years of training had prepared him for this exact moment, when someone would mistake his discipline for weakness, his professionalism for vulnerability. The security guard was still 10 seconds away, pushing through the crowd as fast as he could manage. Lisa was reaching out desperately toward her boyfriend, trying to grab his arm before he could follow through on what she could see he was about to do. But Danny was beyond stopping. In his mind, he had been challenged and disrespected, and the only way to restore his sense of self-worth was to prove that the impressive soldier in front of him was just another man who could be broken. As his fist started forward, aimed directly at Ben's jaw, Danny had no idea that he was about to discover just how wrong he was about the young guard's training, discipline, and capability. The moment Danny's fist began its journey toward Ben's face, time seemed to split into two different speeds. For the crowd of tourists, everything happened in a blur that their eyes could barely follow. For Ben Russell, his military training kicked in and the world slowed to crystal-clear precision. Ben had been preparing for this exact moment from the second Danny had approached him. Every hostile word, every aggressive gesture, every step closer had been catalogued and assessed by his trained mind. When Danny's shoulder dropped and his weight shifted forward, Ben's body was already responding before the punch was even thrown. The defensive move Ben executed was not some dramatic martial arts technique from an action movie. It was practical, efficient military training designed for one purpose: neutralize the threat with minimal force while protecting himself and maintaining order. Every movement had been practiced thousands of times until it became pure instinct. As Danny's right hook came toward his jaw, Ben's left hand moved with lightning speed to deflect the incoming punch. His palm struck the inside of Danny's wrist, redirecting the force of the blow harmlessly past his head. At the exact same moment, Ben's right hand shot forward in a precise palm strike aimed at the center of Danny's chest. The strike was perfectly calculated. Not too high to risk serious injury to Danny's throat or face, not too low to potentially damage internal organs. Ben's palm connected with Danny's sternum with just enough force to knock the wind out of him and send him stumbling backward, but not enough to cause lasting damage. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Danny's world exploded into confusion and pain. One moment he had been throwing what he was certain would be a devastating punch that would finally get a reaction from the stoic guard. The next moment he was gasping for air and stumbling backward, his chest feeling like it had been hit by a freight train. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, cheers, and shocked exclamations. Phones that had been recording throughout the confrontation captured the moment in dozens of different angles. The sound of collective surprise rippled through the gathered tourists as they processed what they had just witnessed. "Did you see that? Bloody hell. Is he all right?" That was incredible. Danny crashed to the pavement, his hands clutching his chest as he struggled to breathe. The palm strike had been precisely placed to temporarily paralyze his diaphragm, leaving him gasping like a fish out of water. His face had gone from red with anger to pale with shock and lack of oxygen. Ben immediately returned to his position of attention, his rifle back in its proper place. His eyes once again fixed on that distant point beyond the crowd. To anyone watching, it was as if the entire confrontation had been a brief interruption in his duties, no more significant than a passing cloud blocking the sun for a moment. But Ben's heart was racing. Despite his training, despite his preparation, actually having to defend himself while on ceremonial duty was serious business. He knew that every second of the incident would be reviewed, analyzed, and investigated. His response would be scrutinized by his superiors to ensure it had been appropriate and proportional. Lisa rushed to Danny's side, her face a mixture of relief that the confrontation was over and terror at seeing her boyfriend writhing on the ground. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly over his chest, not sure whether to touch him or give him space to breathe. Danny, are you okay?" she cried, though it was obvious he was not okay. Danny couldn't respond. Every attempt to speak resulted in nothing but gasping and wheezing. The strike had been perfectly placed to temporarily disable his ability to breathe normally, without causing permanent damage. It was a textbook example of appropriate defensive force, enough to stop the threat, not enough to seriously injure the attacker. The security guard who had been pushing through the crowd finally arrived, immediately taking control of the situation. He spoke rapidly into his radio, calling for backup and medical assistance while keeping his eyes on Danny to assess whether he posed any continued threat. "Medical to Gate 1. Priority response," he said into his radio. "1 male down. Difficulty breathing. Situation under control." Other guards who had been stationed around the palace perimeter were now converging on the scene, their training ensuring that they responded as a coordinated unit. But they moved without panic, without unnecessary drama. This was exactly the kind of situation they had prepared for. The crowd was buzzing with excitement and shock. Tourists who had been uncomfortable with Danny's aggressive behavior were now openly celebrating Ben's professional response. "Good on him," said the elderly British man who had tried to intervene earlier. "About time someone taught that bully a lesson. Did you see how fast that was?" A young American tourist asked his girlfriend. "That guard is seriously trained." "I got it all on video," announced a teenager already uploading the footage to social media. "This is going to go viral." Danny was slowly beginning to get his breath back, though each inhalation was still painful and difficult. As oxygen returned to his brain, so did the awareness of what had just happened. The confident, aggressive man who had been taunting Ben just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone who was confused, embarrassed, and increasingly frightened. I can't breathe properly," he wheezed to Lisa. "Just take slow breaths," she said. though she had no idea if that was the right advice. Help is coming. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient response a testament to the security protocols around the royal residence. They quickly assessed Danny's condition, checking his breathing, his pulse, and asking questions about what had happened. Looks like a blow to the solar plexus, the lead paramedic explained to his partner. Classic defensive strike. His breathing should normalize in a few minutes, but we'll want to check for any other injuries. As the medical team worked, Danny began to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. He had attacked a royal guard in front of dozens of witnesses, and it had been captured on multiple cameras. The alcohol was still in his system, but fear was rapidly sobering him up. Ben remained at his post throughout the entire medical response, never breaking character, never acknowledging what had happened. To him, the incident was over. He had neutralized a threat using appropriate force, and now he was back to his regular duties. The professionalism of his response was as impressive as the speed of his defensive action. The crowd slowly began to disperse as the immediate drama concluded. But many tourists lingered, still processing what they had witnessed. This was the kind of authentic London experience that no guidebook could have prepared them for. Police officers arrived to take statements and assess whether charges would be filed. Danny's assault on a serving member of the military was a serious offense, made worse by the public nature of the incident and the fact that it had been recorded from multiple angles. As Danny was helped to his feet by the paramedics, still shaky and pale, he finally understood the true cost of his afternoon's poor decisions. What had started as a fun tourist day with his girlfriend had transformed into a criminal incident that would follow him for years to come. Ben Russell continued to stand at attention, a perfect example of military discipline and training. He had done exactly what he was supposed to do, protect himself and maintain order with the minimum force necessary. The incident would be reviewed and investigated, but Ben knew his response had been textbook perfect. The viral video was already spreading across social media platforms, watched by millions of people around the world who would see Danny's aggressive behavior and Ben's professional response as a perfect example of why you should never underestimate trained military personnel. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was controlled chaos. Danny sat on the ground where the paramedics had positioned him, still struggling with his breathing but slowly recovering from the precise strike that had knocked him down. Around him, the scene buzzed with activity as police officers, security personnel, and medical staff worked to process what had just occurred. Lisa knelt beside Danny, her face streaked with tears of embarrassment and fear. The romantic weekend she had been looking forward to for months had turned into a nightmare she couldn't have imagined. The man she thought she knew, the gentle electrician who made her laugh and held her hand during movies, had just publicly assaulted a royal guard in front of dozens of witnesses. "How could you do this?" she whispered to Danny, her voice breaking. "How could you ruin everything like this?" Danny tried to respond, but his throat was dry and his chest still ached from Ben's defensive strike. More than the physical pain, though, was the dawning realization of what he had done. The alcohol was still clouding his judgment, but fear was rapidly burning through the haze, bringing unwelcome clarity. Detective Sergeant Claire Morrison was the first police officer to arrive on scene. She had been patrolling nearby when the call came in about an assault on a royal guard. As a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, she had seen plenty of tourist incidents around the major London attractions, but assaulting a ceremonial guard was particularly serious. "Right then," she said, approaching Danny with her notebook ready. "I'm Detective Sergeant Morrison. Can you tell me your name and what happened here?" Danny looked up at her with confusion and growing panic. The confident man who had been shouting insults just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the serious legal trouble he was facing. My name's Danny Cooper," he managed to say. "I'm from Birmingham." "I didn't mean, I was just what, Mr. Cooper?" D.S. Morrison asked patiently. She had dealt with plenty of intoxicated individuals who had made poor decisions, and she recognized the signs of someone sobering up to the reality of their situation. Before Danny could answer, several witnesses stepped forward to give their accounts. The elderly British man who had tried to intervene earlier was eager to speak to the police. "Officer, I saw the whole thing," he said firmly. "This man was harassing that poor guard for several minutes, getting more and more aggressive. The guard never responded, never provoked him. Then this fellow tried to punch him, and the guard defended himself. Perfectly reasonable response if you ask me. Other witnesses nodded in agreement, and D.S. Morrison quickly realized she had a clear-cut case with multiple reliable witnesses and, as she soon discovered, extensive video evidence. "I've got the whole thing on my phone," announced the teenager who had been recording. "Want me to send it to you?" Within minutes, D.S. Morrison had access to several different video angles of the incident. The footage clearly showed Danny's escalating aggression, his unprovoked attack, and Ben's measured defensive response. From a legal standpoint, it was an open and shut case. The paramedics had determined that Danny's injuries were minor, temporary breathing difficulty from the solar plexus strike, but no lasting damage. As his breathing returned to normal, so did his full awareness of the situation he was in. Am I going to be arrested?" Danny asked weakly. D.S. Morrison looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had explained legal consequences to countless individuals over the years. "Mr. Cooper, you've assaulted a serving member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while they were on duty. That's a serious criminal offense. You'll be coming with us to answer some questions." The crowd of tourists was still substantial, many of them continuing to film as Danny was helped to his feet and read his rights. The viral nature of the incident was already becoming apparent as people shared videos on social media platforms, adding hashtags like Chu, Royal Guard Justice, and Don't Mess with the Guard. Lisa watched in horror as handcuffs were placed on Danny's wrists. The man she had been planning a future with was being arrested in front of Buckingham Palace while hundreds of strangers recorded the moment on their phones. "What about me?" she asked D.S. Morrison desperately. "What am I supposed to do?" "You're not under arrest, miss," the officer replied kindly. "But you might want to think about getting yourself back to your hotel. This is going to take some time to sort out." As Danny was led toward the police van, the full weight of his actions began to settle on his shoulders. The alcohol was finally wearing off, replaced by a crushing sense of shame and regret. He turned back to look at Lisa, wanting to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo what he had done. But Lisa was looking at him like she was seeing a stranger. The gentleness in her eyes that he had fallen in love with had been replaced by disappointment and disgust. Without saying a word, she turned and walked away, leaving Danny to face the consequences of his actions alone. "Lisa, wait," he called out, but she didn't turn around. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama concluded, but the buzz of conversation continued. Tourists excitedly discussed what they had witnessed, already crafting the stories they would tell when they returned home. "Did you see how fast that guard moved? That drunk idiot had it coming. Best entertainment we've had all holiday." I felt sorry for his girlfriend. She looked mortified. Ben Russell remained at his post throughout the entire aftermath, maintaining his professional composure as if nothing had happened. This level of discipline and focus was exactly what his training had prepared him for. The incident would be reported and reviewed, but Ben knew he had responded appropriately to a genuine threat. As the police van drove away with Danny in the back, D.S. Morrison gathered the final witness statements and collected contact information from the tourists who had filmed the incident. The case would be straightforward to prosecute given the clear video evidence and multiple reliable witnesses. The viral spread of the video was already beginning. Within an hour of the incident, footage was appearing on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, viewed by thousands of people who were fascinated by the dramatic confrontation and its swift resolution. Comments flooded in from around the world. "Don't mess with the Queen's Guard. That's what happens when you disrespect the military. Perfect defensive technique, just enough force to stop the threat. Feel sorry for the girlfriend. She seemed horrified. Hope this idiot learned his lesson." Local news stations in London picked up the story by evening, with the footage being broadcast on the 6 o'clock news. The incident was being framed as an example of the professionalism and training of the Royal Guards, with Danny cast as the cautionary tale of what happens when tourists behave badly. Back at the police station, Danny sat in a holding cell, fully sober now and completely aware of how drastically his life had changed in the space of a few minutes. The confident electrician who had started the day planning his future with Lisa was gone, replaced by a man facing criminal charges and viral internet shame. He thought about Lisa walking away from him, about the disappointment in her eyes, about the videos that were probably already spreading across the internet. The weekend that was supposed to bring them closer together had instead destroyed their relationship and potentially his future. Danny Cooper had learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that actions have consequences, and that sometimes those consequences are far more severe than the momentary satisfaction of poor decisions. The holding cell at Belgravia police station was nothing like the ones Danny had seen in movies. It was clean, well-lit, and depressingly mundane. Danny sat on the hard bench, his head in his hands, trying to process how quickly his life had unraveled. The alcohol had completely worn off now, leaving him with crystal-clear awareness of what he had done and what it might cost him. Detective Sergeant Morrison entered the interview room where Danny had been brought for questioning. She carried a thick file containing witness statements, photographs, and printed screenshots from the various videos that had captured his assault on the Royal Guard. Right then, "Mr. Cooper," she began, settling into her chair across from him. "Let's start from the beginning. Can you tell me what happened this afternoon at Buckingham Palace?" Danny's throat was dry and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I was drunk. I made a terrible mistake. I never meant for any of this to happen." "But it did happen," D.S. Morrison replied matter-of-factly. "You approached Private Russell, harassed him for several minutes, and then attempted to strike him in the face. Multiple witnesses confirm this, and we have extensive video evidence." She opened the file and placed several printed screenshots in front of Danny. The images showed him clearly, red-faced, aggressive, pointing at Ben, and in the final photo, with his fist pulled back ready to throw the punch. Danny stared at the photographs, barely recognizing himself. The man in those images looked like a stranger, angry, violent, completely out of control. Was that really who he was underneath his usual mild-mannered exterior? "I don't understand what happened to me," he said quietly. "I'm not a violent person. I've never been in a fight in my life. I work hard, I pay my taxes, I've never even had a speeding ticket." D.S. Morrison had heard similar statements countless times over her career. Good people who made catastrophically bad decisions often struggled to reconcile their actions with their self-image. "Alcohol can certainly impair judgment," she acknowledged, "but it doesn't change the fact that you committed assault on a serving member of the armed forces. That's a serious offense, Mr. Cooper. You're looking at potential jail time." The words hit Danny like a physical blow. Jail time. He had gone from planning a romantic weekend with his girlfriend to facing the possibility of prison. The magnitude of how completely he had destroyed his life was overwhelming. Meanwhile, back at their hotel, Lisa was packing their belongings with tears streaming down her face. Every item she folded reminded her of the happy plans they had made just that morning. The guidebook they had marked up with places to visit. The nice clothes Danny had brought for their fancy dinner reservation. The small gift he had bought her at the London Eye, a snow globe with Big Ben inside. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Friends back home had seen the videos that were spreading across social media and were messaging her with concern and curiosity. The incident was going viral with hashtags like Royal Guard Justice and Buckingham Palace Fail. She watched one of the videos that someone had sent her, seeing the confrontation from a bystander's perspective. The Danny in the video was someone she didn't recognize, aggressive, belligerent, cruel. When had he become capable of such behavior? How had she missed this side of him during their 3 years together? Her phone rang. It was her sister calling from Birmingham. "Lisa, I just saw the video online. Is that really Danny? Are you okay?" Lisa broke down completely. "I don't know who that was," she sobbed. "That wasn't the man I fell in love with. I'm so embarrassed, so ashamed. How could he do this? Where are you now? Are you safe?" "I'm at the hotel packing. I can't stay here. I can't be part of this anymore." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Lisa's life. Her sister helped her change her train ticket to return to Birmingham that evening, leaving Danny to face the consequences of his actions alone. Back at the police station, the questioning continued. D.S. Morrison was thorough but fair, walking Danny through every moment of the incident while building the case that would be presented to prosecutors. "What was your intention when you approached Private Russell?" she asked. I thought it would be funny to try to make him react. It was stupid. I was showing off. And when he didn't respond, why did you continue?" Danny struggled to find words that would make sense of his behavior. "I guess I felt like he was ignoring me, like he thought he was better than me. The alcohol made everything seem like a challenge. So you decided to punch him?" I wasn't thinking clearly. I wanted him to acknowledge me, to react somehow. When he wouldn't, I got angry. The interview lasted for hours with Danny's solicitor, a duty lawyer who had been called in to represent him, advising him throughout. By the end, the case was clear-cut. Danny had committed assault in full view of dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras. There was no ambiguity about what had happened or who was responsible. The viral nature of the incident was also becoming a significant factor. By evening, the video had been viewed millions of times across various social media platforms. News outlets were picking up the story, framing it as an example of the professionalism of the Royal Guards and the consequences of disrespectful tourist behavior. Danny's employer back in Birmingham had already seen the footage. His supervisor called him while he was still at the police station. "Danny, it's Mike. I've just seen what happened in London. I'm sorry, mate, but we can't keep you on after this. The company reputation. We can't be associated with someone who attacks military personnel." The job loss was devastating but not surprising. No employer wanted to be linked to someone whose violent behavior had been broadcast to millions of people around the world. When Danny was finally released on bail late that evening, he found himself alone outside the police station with nowhere to go. Lisa had already returned to Birmingham, leaving him a brief note at the hotel explaining that their relationship was over. "I can't be with someone who would do what you did today," the note read. "The man I fell in love with would never have attacked someone who couldn't fight back. I need time to figure out who you really are and whether that person is someone I want in my life." The train journey back to Birmingham was the longest few hours of Danny's life. He sat in an empty carriage watching the countryside pass by while scrolling through the online comments about his incident. The vast majority were critical, condemning his behavior and praising the guard's professional response. Some comments were sympathetic, acknowledging that people can make terrible mistakes when drinking. But those were vastly outnumbered by the harsh criticism and mockery. Danny had become a cautionary tale, a viral example of how not to behave as a tourist. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Saw the news, love. Come home when you're ready to talk. We'll figure this out together." At least his family still cared about him even after what he had done. But Danny knew that rebuilding his life would be a long and difficult process. He had lost his job, his girlfriend, his reputation, and potentially his freedom, all for a few minutes of drunken aggression that had seemed so important at the time. As the train pulled into Birmingham New Street Station, Danny faced the reality that he would be returning to a life that was fundamentally changed. The consequences of his actions would follow him for years to come, a permanent reminder of how quickly poor decisions can destroy everything you've worked to build. The viral video would never truly disappear from the internet. Future employers, potential romantic partners, and anyone who Googled his name would find footage of his worst moment played out for the world to see. Danny Cooper had learned, in the most public way possible, that some mistakes can't be undone. 3 months had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and Danny Cooper's life bore little resemblance to what it had been before that fateful weekend in London. He sat in the waiting area of Birmingham Magistrates' Court, wearing his only remaining good suit and trying to calm his nerves before his sentencing hearing. The viral video had accumulated over 50 million views across all platforms. Danny had become an unwitting internet celebrity, but not the kind anyone would want to be. His face was recognizable to millions of people around the world as the man who had foolishly attacked a royal guard and been swiftly put in his place. The legal process had been straightforward but emotionally draining. Danny had pleaded guilty to assault at his first appearance on the advice of his solicitor. The evidence was overwhelming, and fighting the charges would only have prolonged the inevitable while increasing the potential sentence. His barrister, Helen Griffiths, had worked hard to present mitigating factors to the court. Danny's previously clean record, his genuine remorse, the character references from family and former colleagues, and his struggles with alcohol were all part of the case for leniency. "The defendant deeply regrets his actions," she had told the magistrate during the hearing. This was completely out of character for Mr. Cooper, who has never been in trouble with the law before. He has already paid a significant price through the loss of his employment and relationship and the public humiliation he has endured. The unemployment had been the most immediate practical consequence. After being fired from his electrical contracting job, Danny had struggled to find new employment. The viral nature of his incident meant that potential employers could easily find video footage of his worst moment with a simple internet search. He had applied for dozens of positions over the past 3 months, only to be turned down repeatedly. Sometimes the rejections were direct acknowledgments that they had seen the video. Other times, employers simply stopped responding to his applications after conducting their background research. Danny had been forced to move back in with his parents, sleeping in his childhood bedroom at the age of 28. His mother, Patricia, had been endlessly supportive, helping him through the darkest periods of shame and depression that followed the incident. "Everyone makes mistakes, love," she had told him repeatedly. "The measure of a person isn't whether they fall down, but whether they get back up and learn from it." His father, Robert, had been less forgiving initially. A former military man himself, he was particularly ashamed of Danny's attack on a serving soldier. But over time, seeing his son's genuine remorse and efforts to change, even Robert had softened his stance. The relationship with Lisa was beyond repair. She had blocked him on all social media platforms and asked mutual friends not to share information about either of them. Danny had written her several letters apologizing for his behavior, but had received no response. The romantic future they had planned together was gone forever. The court proceedings were relatively brief. Magistrate Jennifer Walsh, who had reviewed all the evidence and character references, delivered Danny's sentence with the gravity appropriate to the situation. "Mr. Cooper, your actions that day were deplorable," she began. "You attacked a young man who was simply doing his duty, serving his country with honor and professionalism. Your behavior was witnessed by dozens of people, including children, and has been viewed by millions more online." Danny kept his eyes down, feeling the weight of her words and the shame they carried. "However," the magistrate continued, "I note that this appears to be completely out of character for you. You have no previous convictions, and the references provided speak to your generally good character when you are not under the influence of alcohol." The sentence was a suspended prison term of 6 months, suspended for 2 years, along with 200 hours of community service and mandatory alcohol counseling. Danny would not go to jail unless he committed another offense within the next 2 years. "Consider this a second chance, Mr. Cooper," Magistrate Walsh concluded. "Use it wisely." Outside the courthouse, Danny felt a mixture of relief and determination. The legal consequences were serious but manageable. The real work of rebuilding his life was just beginning. The alcohol counseling had already started, and Danny was surprised by how much it had helped. Speaking with a therapist about his relationship with drinking had revealed patterns he hadn't recognized before. The incident at Buckingham Palace hadn't been his first poor decision while intoxicated, just the most public and consequential one. Alcohol doesn't create new personality traits, his counselor, Dr. Andrew Morrison, had explained, but it can amplify existing feelings and remove the filters that usually control our behavior. The anger and resentment you felt that day, those emotions were already there. The alcohol just gave them permission to come out. The therapy sessions had been difficult but enlightening. Danny had been forced to confront aspects of his personality that he had previously ignored or justified. His feelings of inadequacy, his resentment toward people he perceived as more successful or respected than himself, his tendency to use alcohol as a confidence booster. All of these had contributed to the perfect storm that led to his public downfall. The community service had been assigned to a local veterans charity, which Danny initially found ironic and uncomfortable, given that he had attacked a serviceman. But working with the organization had become one of the most meaningful parts of his rehabilitation. Many of the veterans he met through his service had their own stories of poor decisions and second chances. Former soldiers who had struggled with alcohol, who had made mistakes that cost them jobs or relationships, who had found ways to rebuild their lives through service to others. "We all carry our worst moments," one elderly veteran named Frank had told him. "The question is whether we let them define us or teach us." Danny had also been working part-time at a local community center, helping with maintenance and odd jobs. The pay was minimal, but it gave him structure and purpose while he continued looking for full-time employment. The center's manager, aware of Danny's situation, had given him a chance when others wouldn't. As he walked home from the courthouse, Danny's phone buzzed with a message from an old friend who had seen news coverage of his sentencing. "Glad you got a second chance, mate. Everyone deserves one. Fancy a coffee sometime?" No alcohol involved, obviously. It was the first message of support Danny had received from his old social circle since the incident. Most of his friends had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the public attention, and ashamed to be associated with his behavior. 6 months later, Danny was working full-time again, having finally found an employer willing to overlook his viral moment of shame. The job paid less than his previous position and required a longer commute, but it was honest work that allowed him to support himself and begin repaying his parents for their support during his lowest period. He had completed his community service hours and continued attending alcohol counseling voluntarily. Danny had not had a drink since the day of the incident, recognizing that alcohol had been the catalyst for the worst decision of his life. The viral video still existed, of course. It would probably follow him forever, a permanent reminder of his failure accessible to anyone with an internet connection. But Danny had learned to live with that reality, understanding that true redemption comes not from erasing past mistakes, but from demonstrating genuine change through future actions. He had written one final letter to Lisa, not seeking reconciliation, but simply to acknowledge the pain he had caused her, and to let her know that he had learned from his mistakes. He didn't expect a response and didn't receive one, but writing the letter had provided a sense of closure. Ben Russell, the Royal Guard who had defended himself so professionally that day, continued his service with the same dedication and skill. The incident had been thoroughly reviewed by his superiors, who concluded that his response had been textbook perfect, precisely the right amount of force to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm. Ben rarely thought about the incident anymore. It had been one moment in a career dedicated to service and duty. He had done his job, protected himself and others, and moved on. That was what professional soldiers did. For Danny Cooper, however, the incident remained a defining moment, not because it represented who he truly was, but because it had forced him to confront who he didn't want to be. The man who had attacked a Royal Guard in a drunken rage was gone, replaced by someone who understood the value of self-control, respect for others, and the importance of thinking before acting. The viral video would never disappear, but Danny had learned that he didn't need it to. He had learned to live with his worst moment being public knowledge, to find redemption not in hiding from his mistakes but in demonstrating that people can change, can learn, can become better than their worst decisions. As he walked through Birmingham's city center, Danny passed other people going about their daily lives, most of them unaware that they were sharing the street with the man from that famous video. He had learned that most people move on from viral content much faster than the people featured in it expect. The internet's attention span is short, always moving on to the next scandal, the next moment of outrage.